When I say civil rights, I'm guessing that most of you are probably thinking this kind of stuff, right? Black civil rights movement, 1950s, 1960s. Think about some of these iconic images, figures. Thinking about the Brown decision in 1954, Emmett Till's murder, 1955, the Montgomery bus boycotts, Rosa Parks, maybe Fannie Lou Hamer, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., Black Panthers, the signing maybe of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act of 1965, civil rights, right? Important elements of civil rights. Some of you, maybe not as many, are thinking about women's rights movement. Oftentimes we think of it in waves. First wave would be like the suffragettes, right? The right to vote. And we're thinking of people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony. Second wavers like Gloria Steinem, Betty Friedan. Maybe you're thinking about women of color who pushed white middle-class women to think a little bit differently about the experience of women. People like Patricia Hill Collins, Bell Hooks, folks like that. Maybe when I say civil rights, you think about the gay rights movement. More contemporary. These iconic figures and images aren't as common in our lore. We have image of Stonewall, of course, often considered to be the beginning of the gay rights movement. Politicians like Congressman Frank and Harvey Milk. You might think about Matthew Shepard, who was murdered in Wyoming, the college student. Maybe Ellen DeGeneres, not only in terms of being an actor, but maybe also in the work that she does as an activist as well. Anita Cornwell, for instance, a lesbian activist. So these are all ways that we might think about civil rights. But the term is sort of emotion-laden. And nobody's against civil rights. Right? You don't hear people saying, you know what I hate? I can't stand civil rights. That's not really a thing. But that forces us then to consider this broader question, what's a right? What does it mean if we're going to say we have to not only have these things, but maybe protect them, we have to know what they are. And of course, we don't have time in 15 minutes to get into all the ins and outs of the philosophy of what the constitutional legal aspects of it. But essentially, rights are entitlements. Things to which we are entitled. And broadly speaking, we can think of them in two categories, legal categories and more moral categories. And the second one's the one that's most challenging. So I got to plug my book, right? I know you've already pre-ordered on Amazon for this summer. In my new book, I wrestle with not just the idea of rights, but the intersection of race, gender, and economic inequality. To try to understand through the lens of education, employment, the criminal justice system, wealth and income, and health, not to mention things like affirmative action, what it means to have equality or to move towards social justice. It's going to look different to different folks. In this room, we're all going to have different ideas, probably not only about how to get there, but even what it looks like at all. And so these are big questions, and it's timely. I think it's timely that we're asking these questions now. Just a couple of weeks ago, Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote an article, a feature story in the Atlantic Monthly, arguing for financial reparations for Black Americans, ancestors of slaves. And not only is that a controversial topic, but it's a topic that sort of ebbs and flows. We haven't heard much about it recently. It's coming back. And I think the reason it comes back is because of the tremendous economic inequality that we're witnessing. That is, we get stuck on income, how much people make. But that's not really what's most important. It's wealth, how much we're worth. And one of the important things to understand, of course, slavery was abolished well over 100 years ago. But the ability to pass wealth from generation to generation is something that Black families haven't been able to do. And so as we see the wealth gap not only persisting but getting larger, I think it comes time that we have to have these important conversations. Is this part of civil rights movement? 40 acres and a mule and whatnot. And of course, just 2 weeks ago today, right? We had the shootings in California, where we had a young man who engaged in mass shooting essentially because he was sexually frustrated. And I don't mean to say that in sort of a way that trivializes it. He felt a tremendous entitlement to have romantic attention from women, and he wasn't getting it. And so in response to that shooting, a lot of men came forward to say, don't paint me with that broad brush. Don't start throwing around terms like misogyny and sexism and so forth and make it sound like all men. And a hashtag started, not all men. Very quickly after that hashtag comes yes, all women. And I urge you to read it. Go to Twitter and just read through the tweets. Millions of them now, well over 1 million tweets with the hashtag yes, all women. Because while it's true that not all men act in violent ways and have overt and explicit ideas that run contrary to the civil rights of women and the human rights of women, all women on a regular basis in a patriarchal system live with rape culture and misogyny and fear. And the experiences and the stories in 140 characters or fewer of so many women who have come forward to talk about these things is quite powerful. And so we need to think about, in the light of third wave feminism, maybe this Twitter hashtag will become one of those iconic figures that will be on somebody's tip talk in 20 years. I don't know. But also legal rights. We're in an interesting position with respect to legal rights as well. Just last summer, about a year ago a year ago this month for sure, the Supreme Court made a very interesting and somewhat controversial decision, 5-4 decision, in Shelby County versus Holder, that nullified one portion of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It was the portion that required that certain states that with a history of voter discrimination get clearance from the Justice Department before making any changes to their voter laws, right? 5-4 decisions, we got lots of them. Of course, it's going to be controversial. That's all fine. What was interesting to me was Chief Justice Roberts, who wrote the opinion. His rationale was very interesting. And essentially, he was saying, we're beyond that now. Not beyond it in terms of we don't need it, but that even though that portion of the law was recently reauthorized by Congress, that is, in other words, it wasn't that the law had just been sitting there since 1965. It was recently reauthorized by Congress. He said, we need to take a tougher look. Because we're past that. It's a different world now. I mean, he didn't say, I got black friends and we have a black president, but it's essentially, your friends have said those kinds of things. And he has some interesting points to raise, right? That maybe we have to think about civil rights differently than we did in 1965. In the last couple of years, this is starting to surface, what we're calling Jim Queer, right? If we had Jim Crow, which was the public segregation in the American South, in between the end of Reconstruction, really, and the middle of the 1960s. These aren't real water fountains, by the way, of course. There's somebody photoshopped this. But the point is that there are, at the same time where we see support for gay rights in public opinion polls changing dramatically and rapidly, and at the same time we see many states moving toward extending marriage rights to gay and lesbian couples, for instance. Some states are moving in the other direction, not specifically on those issues, but there's a series of laws that are sometimes referred to as freedom of religion laws that, I want to be careful how I say it, they protect businesses from discrimination lawsuits if they refuse to do business with gay and lesbian customers on the basis of the business owner's religion, okay? So if I own a company and you're gay, and you come into my store, and I say, we don't serve your kind here, these laws would protect me from being sued by you for discrimination, right? So that's it. That's how it works. And of course, you can imagine they're controversial. We have a priest here sort of saying that's not a good idea, and this is a protest picture, right? Essentially, if we don't think this is okay, that we had black and white water fountains in Mississippi in the 1950s, then we ought not have something like this. But of course, this is much more complicated. I think that the comparison with Jim Crow is valid in some ways, but also troublesome in other ways. One of the things about Jim Crow, of course, is that Jim Crow was protected public segregation. This is private. Doesn't make it better, but it does make it different. So I think what we have to determine then is, and the second thing is that one of the arguments is, well, race and gender are not, quote unquote, immutable characteristics. Right? I can look at somebody and more or less ascertain gender. Even if I can't ascertain sex, I can ascertain gender. I can more or less ascertain race. Sometimes it's more complicated than others. But I can't look at somebody and determine sexual orientation. I think the problem with the word immutable, we're expecting LGBT folks to mute this characteristic, which is an essential characteristic. But just because, it really reminds us of don't ask, don't tell. Don't let me know you're gay. And so, just in case you think I'm being a little bit silly with this, because you might be thinking, well, I mean, how are they going to know? This isn't about public displays of affection. It isn't about two women walking into a store holding hands. That may be one way that you could ascertain sexual orientation, although that wouldn't be that accurate. But let's imagine, for instance, I wrote a couple examples, so I was afraid I was going to forget. Let's imagine that a couple is planning a wedding, and they're a gay couple in a state that allows gay marriage. Should a private florist, I own a floral shop now, right? Should I be able to say, I'm not going to do your wedding because you're gay? Or do I have to come up with some creative excuse? I'm washing my hair that day. We're going to be something else. What if a gay couple wishes, who has children, wishes to have a family portrait taken and goes to a portrait studio and says, "Could you please take our picture?" Should that photographer be able to say, "I'm sorry, I'm not going to do that"? Or one argument would be, well, we let the market decide. If we find out that there's shops doing that, maybe not only LGBT folks, but allies too would just say, "I'm not shopping in those places any longer." So I think that's a valid response. But before we jump to those responses, I think we need to consider, would we be okay if we picked one of the less immutable characteristics? In other words, would you be okay? I mean, Rand Paul got into some problems with this a few years ago when he suggested that maybe the Civil Rights Act of 1964 wasn't that important because if people just boycotted businesses who discriminated, you wouldn't need laws to protect. Would we be okay if that same florist said, I don't do weddings with black folks involved? I'm not taking pictures. I don't take pictures of Latino families. I'm not going to do that. Will we be okay with those things too? So the question though becomes, yeah, professor, but it's LGBT, so there's a religious component. It's their religion that they're protecting. Their religion says they can't be okay with gay. Don't forget, that water fountain that I showed you at the beginning, all of that was rooted in religion, in Christianity, right? People pounding on Bibles saying this is wrong. Interracial marriage, it's wrong, right? Having slaves be free was wrong based on the Bible, right? I mean, we're using a religion a lot of the time. So before we start to say, well, there's fundamental differences, remember that we're always arguing that there's some sort of difference. One of the things I wanted to point out was that this is beyond what's going on now. It's rooted in this clash of fundamental values. This is John Zaller's political scientist at UCLA, and over 20 years ago now, he and his colleagues argued that so much of our public debate comes to this fundamental clash of values, that as Americans we're socialized to believe certain things, and we believe them very deeply. And usually when there's a public policy question that's tricky, it's because these core values are involved, and we may come to different perspectives on them. I think in this one, with regard to these new laws, the Jim Queer laws, as we're calling them, freedom of religious practice, that's something that we all probably agree with, right? There's not a lot of people in here going, nah, I think people should, let's have a national religion, and let's not allow people to celebrate otherwise. Right of privacy is something we all sort of believe. But also equality is something that we hold on to dearly as a fundamental American value. And so you can't have all of these, right? Because they're going to come down on different sides of things. It's not simply that people are being unreasonable on one side or the other. It's that we're perceiving them as unreasonable because they're deeply rooted in particular values that we don't think are as important from our position. So here we are. We're back to this position now where we don't know for sure whether or not, how people will judge us in 20 years. What will we say to our grandchildren about the issues that are going on today? That sign looks so ridiculous to us. We can't even imagine a time where there would be signs like this. But at the time, of course, it was very natural to see those things all throughout the South. So what I wanted to leave you with was this thought that comes from Patricia Ireland, the former president of the National Organization for Women, who reminds us never to confuse progress with equality. So we wouldn't make the argument that things aren't better today than they were 50 years ago, 100 years ago, even 20 years ago with respect to civil rights. But just because we've made progress doesn't mean that we're at a place where we have to be comfortable. Don't confuse progress with equality. That's all I got. Thanks.